Who's the biggest energy user in the US? What part of the government? Okay. How much energy is that of the total energy use of the United States? How much is that? 1.9%. Nice. Who's the second biggest energy user in the United States? Department of Defense. 1.9%. Who's the second biggest energy user in the US? Walmart. 1.8%. Who has improved vehicle efficiency by 30% in the last 5 years?
Walmart. Including tanks and vehicles.
Walmart. Who has cut energy use of their buildings by a third in the last 10 years? Walmart. Yeah. So who was the most effective briefer of the Defense Science Board to have the conversation with the senior energy officials at the Pentagon? Walmart. Yeah. So we were impaneled. There's a group that works for the Secretary of Defense called the Defense Science Board. And within that, periodically, the Secretary of Defense writes a letter that says this issue needs to be looked at. And so they put together a panel that includes a lot of different folks from inside and outside of the military to look at a specific task. And we were impaneled as an energy task force by Secretary Rumsfeld because of concerns about rising energy costs. And so that group was supposed to meet for 6 months and do a report. 2.5 years later, that process was completed. One of the key pieces that came out of that was asking, what does energy cost, right? So if I'm the military, what is my assumed cost for a gallon of fuel? It's basically the wholesale cost of that fuel. But what does that fuel cost out in the point of a battlefield in Afghanistan? Yeah, their costs can range from $4 to $40 to $400 a gallon. And so that's what's called the fully burdened cost of fuel. And that's the cost to get it from where you buy it to where it's used at the point of kinetics. And that's their term for activities, kinetics. And so in the course of thinking about how that fuel is used, and what the military is using is, the vast majority of the fuel is jet fuel and diesel, and it's predominantly used in either aircraft or generator sets, or gen sets. So if I'm buying a weapon system, a platform, and platforms are aircrafts, weapon systems, or ships, what might be some of the criteria that I would look at for what I'm going to choose? No. Maintenance. Weight. Where it gets deployed, yeah. No. Speed.
Color, amenity.
the amount, it's payload, right? But essentially, its fuel burden was never one of the KPIs, right? And more importantly, the process for getting the fuel to it, right? So we send an aircraft from here to Iraq on a mission, and it doesn't take off and fly straight there, turn around and come back. It's got to get there, and then it has what's called dwell time, the amount of time that it's sort of up in the space doing whatever it's supposed to be doing, which can be minutes to hours, and then it's got to come back to the US. What does it encounter 4 times in that journey? Refueling a tanker. And guess what? Those encounters were not ever really considered part of the cost of operating that system, right? And when you start looking at the manpower associated with that and the equipment and the cost, suddenly you start realizing that a large portion of what's going on in the military is just schlepping stuff around. And in fact, 80% of what they move around in the battle space is what? Fuel. I'll get to you in just a second. And in fact, in Afghanistan, 90% of what they move around is liquid. So water and fuel. Because in Afghanistan, we've been under a contract that started when we first got there to buy all the water from a supplier in Kuwait, so it's all bottled water. And so even though our installations sit on rivers and streams, we can't get the certification to purify that water yet. And so we bring bottled water from Kuwait into the battle space. So, one word. Convoys. The battle space has changed. Our assumption about how you brought things to a point of battle was still based on the idea of a battle front, right? You take over territory, and behind you is area that you have secured, and you have your supply lines going from your point of embarkation to your forward operating system. All right? In the battle space that we are in today, Iraq and Afghanistan, where are the friendlies and where are the other combatants? All around you. So, where have been more than half of the casualties in those conflicts? Convoys. Convoys. We lose 1 life per 24 convoys. So, while the Defense Science Board was struggling with trying to come up with this definition and talk about the fully burdened cost, quite frankly, other than a few geeks and wonks and accountants in the Pentagon, there really, within the military, was no interest in the conversation. Until a couple field commanders came back and said, literally one of them said to the Pentagon and to us, fuck the fully burdened cost, let's talk about the blood burden. I can't lose more people just moving around barrels of oil. That was a pretty significant breakthrough in the culture of the DoD. That led to the second word. So in forward operating bases and other installations for instance, in Iraq, the Army mindset is we're only going to be here temporarily. So what do you put people in? What kind of temporary structure? Tents. Now, we have an all-volunteer army, so we don't want people to be uncomfortable. So what do we do with those tents? Air condition them, right? A 5-ton air conditioner, which is bigger than most American households, or about the size of most American household air conditioners, per tent. Okay? That is burning a gallon of diesel per hour in a genset for each of those tents. So here's the second word. Foam. The Rapid Equipping Force came up with an idea of, we had this long exploration of, let's rethink the tents. And some of the longer explanations are thinking about, future tents will be made with inner layers of nanogel that's flexible like you have in insulated clothing and that, but the stopgap measure, which they've spent $900 million all over the place doing, is foaming the tents, and that increased the about fivefold the insulation value of the tents and dramatically lowered the diesel use. Now they're sort of looking at the bigger systemic questions behind that. But as a result of all this conversation now, thinking about the logistics and the manpower implications and the dollar implications of delivering fuel into the battle space and how that's used is now finally part of one of the KPIs, key performance indicators, used by the DoD. Okay, so that's a transformation that's going on in the battle space. The other transformation is now this exploration of starting to ask questions. Why are we shipping 24 different kinds of batteries and we've got soldiers carrying 70 pounds and of that 20 plus may be batteries? How crazy is that? And why do we have all these different kinds of batteries? How are we charging them and why, throwing them away? And similarly, bottled water as well. And so those explorations are going on, particularly in the Marines right now. The Commandant of the Marines has actually set up an experimental station where they're prototyping all sorts of new stuff on a installation in Virginia. And they've just invited almost anyone who has an idea to come in, put that in, and they'll play with it. And the Marines is a good place to do that because they have the quickest cycle time of all of the forces. So those are some of the pieces going on. Now, what did I not mention in all of this? Climate. Two reasons. One, this was under Rumsfeld, and so we were specifically told any conversation about climate was completely off the table. The White House would not allow it. Now that was particularly intriguing because what is the military really good at? What do they think about all of the time? Risk, threats. Okay? Their whole world is thinking about risk and threats. And it comes down to two columns. First column, probability. Second column, impact, right? So what was the big one that they were focused on for more than 40 years? Nuclear war. How would you categorize that? Low probability, extremely high impact, right? So how are they classifying climate change? And? High impact. And high impact. Well, actually, technically in-house, it's a medium probability because they're not sure how it will wear, but the impact is probably fairly high as well. And so they actually now, if you are a young officer starting about a year and a half ago, in your training sessions, your indoctrination, you actually now go through sessions on climate change. Now, what they will say is they won't get into the causes and they're not going to talk about anthropogenic or that. They just say, look, it's happening, take it as a given. Let's talk about the military implications of this. Now, if you talk to the war planners, they will tell you that we have already had the first climate conflict. Where's that? Darfur. The Pentagon believes that Darfur was the first really measurable and traceable climate conflict. And if you don't know the history there, you had two populations sharing the same area. You had the settled farmers who were the southern Sudanese, and then you had the northern Sudanese who were transient grazers. And when there was enough rain and there was enough foliage there, they could share the same space. The grazers would come through, and that was not a problem. As it got drier and there was less foliage and the settled folks were struggling on their own, they started saying, no, you can't graze through here, and thus we have Darfur, the conflicts in Darfur. And they believe that this is just the first of those. And they believe that they will come over water, they will come over inundation from sea level rise, and they will come from rapid displacement of populations, both internally and externally. So, we would call these refugees, but in international terms, if you're displaced inside a country, you are a displaced person. If you cross the border, you are now a refugee. And so that is the mindset. And they are also doing a fair amount of look at risk assessment, particularly the Navy. The Navy has come to the conclusion that they need to consider a 2-meter sea level rise as the potential implication for their facilities, their installations, and they have mapped out how many of the most significant installations around the world we will lose. So let me move to the second piece of threat, which is what's called CONUS, Continental US. People may recognize this picture, and maybe more importantly, that one. All right? What caused that? Right, what caused that?
A tree branch fell.
Well, we tried to blame the Canadians, yeah. Blame Canada, we'll do the South Park thing, blame Canada. But it was a tree branch in Ohio. And what was the cause of the similarly large blackout that happened 2 years before that on the West Coast? A squirrel got into a substation and shorted it out. So as Carl Rabigo, one of the guys on the Texas PUC said, it's really unfortunate that the stability to our grid is tied to the mental health state of rodents. But there are things that are far more pernicious than rodents out there. And so in the unclassified version, one of the things the Defense Science Board asked Dahlgren, which are the war planners for the US, and INAL, one of the federal labs, to do was how would you take down what would be the most effective way to take down the US economy?
Get rid of the grid.
The scenario is called 6 well-placed rifle shots. 6 well-placed rifle shots. In a matter of minutes, I can shut down the East Coast grid for 20 months with 6 rifle shots. All I'm doing is shooting transformers. Really big transformers that once I put a bullet in them, they leak the oil out and they're gone, and it takes 18 to 20 months to replace them. They're not made in the US anymore. They're not, and some are made in countries that don't necessarily always have our best interest at heart. And you take down the grid. So as Jim Woolsey, the former director of the CIA, said, we will have a lot in common with the Iraqis and people in the Stone Age. That has led to a whole effort called Net Zero Plus. And that is an effort to take the concept of doing net zero energy facilities and installations, which are facilities and installations that have the capability of generating their own power using on-site renewables. And you see a lot of net zero energy work going on in the architectural world. But this is taking it a step further and saying, let's give these the ability to island, meaning the grid goes down around you, you stay up, and the surrounding community right around you, because that's where most of your folks live, stays up as well. Now, by having those islands, what it allows you to do, the reason that they were able to bring most of the East Coast grid back up in 2 to 3 days was this. These islands of power still were existed. If we did a full crash of the grid and had to do black start, we probably couldn't get the grid back up. Not easily. Because every time you turn on a large power plant, you've got to have a reactive load on the other end to take that power. And if there's nothing there to take that power, it'll trip off and go back down. So by having islands there, you string the islands together and you rebuild the grid around that. And that's exactly what happened in that, and that's the scenario that the DoD is moving forward with. Plus, they're also starting to look at their assumed fuel cost pre-Libya, but just with the instabilities they were seeing in the Middle East right now, their assumed fuel cost for this year is $130 a barrel. That's what they're budgeting at right now. And that was pre-Libya. That number's going up. Secretary Mavis of the Energy, of the Navy announced last summer an effort that half of the installations in the United States by 2030 would be net zero plus. Yep. And the Army recently announced that 10 installations will do this as well. So what you are seeing is a sea change around these issues within the military that are not connected to climate, but entirely framed as a national security standpoint. So thank you.